the dramatic collapse of income and increases in poverty, where in 1975 the regional gross national product for sub-Saharan Africa stood at 17.6% of the world's GNP per capita, gross national product. But by 1999 it had dropped to 10.5%. So in the space of 24 years, a drop of 7%. Take into account, which I'll talk a little bit further about later on, that for every dollar in aid that comes into Africa, at least, conservatively estimated, $5 flows out of the continent. Over the last quarter of a century, the African crisis of the late 1970s has been transformed into what has been aptly called the African tragedy. Taken together, we have to acknowledge that the African tragedy, a crisis of multiple dimensions, is not new, has been acute long before the current global crisis. While many people refer to the multidimensional global crisis as a crisis of civilization, it is clear that the crisis of Western civilization is killing what remains of African civilization, just like it did in the earlier era of the civilizations of the Incas and the Aztecs. So what we are seeing, what we are living through, is the final killings of what remains of African civilization. That's what the current stage of neoliberal globalization, neoliberal capitalism means for Africa. Now, it's hardly possible to make a presentation on the impact of the global or financial crisis in Africa, given the fact that Africa is so huge, so diverse, with many different histories. Africa, sure, was colonized, but it wasn't like Latin America. Like America was colonized simply or just by Spain and Portugal. But the Dutch, British, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Portugal were all different colonial powers that occupied the continent and imposed different regimes administratively, politically, economically, and socially. By the time the scramble for Africa was over, some 10,000 different political entities were amalgamated into 40 European colonies. So 10,000 different kingdoms, kingships, clans, into just 40 European colonies and protectorates. As land and people became little more than pieces on a chessboard. Let me quote from British Prime Minister at the time of the scramble for Africa, Lord Salisbury. He says, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, quote, "We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where they were." Following independence and including island states, Africa now consists of 54 sovereign states, of which 33 are least developed countries, so defined. North Africa is much more integrated into networks with Europe and has strong linkages to the Middle East through its large Arab population. We can talk about 5 distinct regions in Africa, namely North, South, East, West, and Central Africa, with their different histories of colonialism and struggle for independence, different languages, different religions. And of course, in this context, post-independence, these have given rise to different regional or sub-regional groupings, such that those we know as the Southern African Development Community, the Economic Community of West African States, the East African Community, etc. These are significant, both because they are obviously an attempt to negotiate Africa's integration into the global economy, but they also attempts at trying to negotiate relations between the different sub-regions inside Africa. Of course, even though we have 33 of the 50 classified least developing countries, these themselves are not homogeneous. Some are landlocked, others have some level of manufacturing industries, and others very tiny populations. All of these have major bearing on their economic prospects and of course how the global economic crisis impacts on them. Of course, there are also more industrialized economies in Africa, such as South Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, which have features of middle-income countries, especially in the case of South Africa, where South Africa accounts for 44% of Africa's total GDP. 44% of Africa's total GDP. And 52% of industrial output. And in fact, South Africa has, although a relatively small economy, has the 12th biggest financial market in the world, mainly as a result of the legacy of capitalist mining, the mining industry. Although I'm trying to give you in a sense that we're talking about a very diverse and a continent with many different histories, there are of course some common features that we can focus on when we talk about Africa and the crisis. If we define sub-Saharan Africa as excluding not only North Africa, but if for the moment we also bracket off South Africa, the key fact about this area, the greater part of the continent, is that after 80 years of colonial rule and almost 5 decades of independence, in most of it, there is some capital, but not a lot of capitalism. There is some capital, but not a lot of capitalism. Africa south of the Sahara exists in a capitalist world, which marks and constrains the lives of its inhabitants at every turn, but it is not of it. And that's a very important fact that we need to understand. Whereas Naomi Klein speaks of disaster capitalism, the Canadian, and it's Canadian, to characterize current capitalist dynamics, Africa's experience with capitalism can be best described as an ever-intensifying, plundering capitalism. If I make the distinction between this notion of disaster capitalism and a plundering capitalism, a capitalism